Everyone's bucket list usually has skydiving or the northern lights, but in chess, it should include learning how to beat pawn to a 4e5. While there's no guaranteed win, one opening gives you a big edge at the amateur level, the Scotch defense. After pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, you can strike with d4, the Scotch Gambit, or first develop with bishop c4 before pushing d4. Knight to f6, you can now play pawn to d4. This immediately challenges black, giving them multiple ways to go wrong. You're threatening to capture the pawn, and also to push forward and attack the knight. Since black feels under pressure, they'll usually capture something here. Out of the three main captures available to black in this position, whether they capture with the knight on e4, capture the pawn on d4, or use the other knight, two of them are fundamentally flawed and quickly lead to disaster. That's exactly why this variation is so dangerous at the club level. Most opponents won't know the theory well enough and can collapse in just a few moves. Let's take the line with knight captures on e4. At first glance, this looks logical and solid. Black places the knight in the center, hoping to gain some initiative. But in reality, this move overextends the knight and leaves it vulnerable. When you recapture, the knight is stranded in enemy territory without proper support, and black's position starts to fall apart. Most players will try to justify this decision by developing actively with bishop to c5. On the surface, this looks strong. The bishop enters the game with tempo, aiming at your central pawn and trying to create counterplay. However, this apparent activity is an illusion. You have a powerful response, queen to d5. This single move creates a web of threats that black simply cannot handle, most notably the immediate and deadly threat of queen captures on f7 checkmate. Along with that, black's overextended knight remains exposed, and suddenly what looked like a promising defense becomes a position that collapses almost instantly. But there's more. In the line with bishop to c5, not only is there the immediate checkmate threat on f7, but the knight on e4 is also hanging. If the knight retreats to safety, then the bishop on c5 will be lost, and that is essentially game over. By move 6, black is already in a hopeless position and should resign. Of course, black might try to defend by capturing the pawn, but even after that, when you move the king away, nothing really changes. The checkmate threat on f7 is still there, and the knight on e4 is still hanging. Black has no good solution. They will be forced to defend against the checkmate, and once they do, you simply win a free piece. The bishop will also remain vulnerable, forcing black to waste even more time while you calmly develop and win with ease. That's how quickly this opening can bring down even fairly experienced opponents. Now let's explore the second option. If capturing with the knight on e4 fails, what if black decides to capture the pawn on d4 instead? At first this seems natural, since they expect you to simply recapture and trade pieces. But instead of that, you have a powerful and very thematic sacrifice. Bishop captures on f7. This is a common idea in many variations of the Scotch Gambit, and it's always worth watching out for. Here, after king captures on f7, it's not even a true sacrifice because you immediately continue with knight captures on c5, giving check to the king. After king moves back to e8, you immediately regain your piece with queen captures on d4. When the dust settles, you are already a pawn up, but even more importantly, black's king is stuck in the center of the board. Since the king has already moved, black has lost the right to castle, which makes their position very unsafe. From here you can just continue with the simplest developing moves, knight to c3, castle kingside, bishop to g5, and black has no real way to protect their king. This is why the position is practically hopeless for them. But of course, there is one correct defense. Instead of retreating the king, the right move for black is to capture your pawn on d4 with their pawn. That's the only way to stay in the game. From this point, there are several possibilities, but the simplest and strongest idea is to castle kingside. This leads into what is known as the Max Lange Attack. The logic behind castling here is that it not only secures your own king, but also prepares your rook to use the e-file, which is often opened in this variation. In fact, castling in this position is both defensive and attacking at the same time. So what can black do now? Naturally, they will worry about you pushing your pawn forward to attack their knight, which can create serious problems. To deal with this, black has two main options. At this stage, black has two main choices. The first option is for black to bite the bullet and capture your pawn on e4, even though it is very dangerous. By doing so, black opens the e-file for your rook, which makes their king vulnerable to a strong attack. Still, some players will take this pawn and simply hope to survive your initiative. The second option is for black to try and hold on to the pawn on d4 by playing bishop to c5. This move makes perfect sense. It develops a piece, prepares to castle kingside, and at the same time defends the pawn on d4 so that you cannot easily recapture it. Most of your opponents will choose one of these two options. Now, regarding the first option, with knight captures on e4, I already have a separate video where I explain how Wesley. So himself was defeated in this very opening, and I also show you exactly how to handle the position as white. So in this video, let's instead focus on the second option, bishop to c5. Here's the plan. Since we're playing a gambit, our goal is to attack, not to retreat. After bishop to c5, you immediately advance with pawn to e5, striking the knight. Although the knight has several squares it could retreat to, each one comes with drawbacks. For example, if the knight moves to the center with knight to e4, which is usually what classical chess principles recommend, it actually backfires here. You can simply play queen to e2, and suddenly the knight on e4 is completely trapped. Now let's take a closer look at the possible retreats for black's knight. If the knight goes to e4, it looks natural because it's the center, but in this position it's a disaster. All the surrounding squares are already controlled by white's pieces. The square itself is even covered twice, by your knight and by your bishop, so the knight is immediately trapped. After this move, black is simply losing. What about knight to g4? At first, that may seem more aggressive because it puts pressure on your pawn on a 5. But in reality, you don't need to worry about that. If black captures the pawn, there's a serious drawback. You can move your rook to e1 and pin the knight against the king. This makes the capture very dangerous for black and often backfires badly. So what should you do here? While there are several strong options, one of the most effective is pawn to c3. This is a common tactical pattern in the Scotch Gambit, and it works surprisingly often. The immediate idea is simple. You're attacking black's bishop on c5. Naturally, your opponent will feel they need to respond, and in practice, 9 times out of 10, they will capture the pawn. But that capture is actually a mistake, because now you unleash one of the classic tactical combinations of this gambit. You sacrifice with bishop captures on f7, forcing the black king out. Then you follow up with queen to d5, regaining your piece while completely exposing black's king. This pattern is one of the deadliest weapons in the Scotch Gambit and can win you many games with ease. After you sacrifice with bishop captures on f7 and then follow up with queen to d5, the black king usually retreats back. You then recapture the bishop, and once again black's biggest problem becomes clear. The king is stuck in the center, exposed and unable to find safety. From this point on, your task is very simple. Just keep developing naturally. Moves like knight to c3 and bishop to g5 are more than enough to keep the pressure going. Black, on the other hand, is completely paralyzed. For example, in a normal position, black would want to develop the dark squared bishop by pushing the pawn to d6. But here, pushing that pawn opens the e-file, which allows your rook to join the attack directly against the king. That makes the move unattractive and risky. If black doesn't push the pawn, then their position is even worse, as their pieces are undeveloped and their king remains trapped in the middle of the board. This is yet another way the Scotch Gambit allows you to win easily. Thanks for watching.